As I said before, is the second one, and the sad road to unnecessary war. So you can see main thesis over here. Already in the opening years of the 20th century, by the time you get to the first years of the 20th century, there were tensions were already building up between the two real powers in the Pacific. Russia had been beaten, China was dysfunctional, and so it's the U.S., and it's Japan, it's Teddy Roosevelt and the Emperor Meiji, as you can see. But on the other hand, neither country wanted a war. And yet, it hovered in the background. People were already talking at that time. If you know anything about Roosevelt, he was very ginger, did a lot of things that could trigger off a war, but they didn't want it. Japan, as I told you yesterday, resented having been cheated out of an indemnity by Roosevelt, as they saw it. They should have got more money from the Russian-Japanese War, as I explained to you, even though they had a chutzpah to say that. In addition, each country held other territory that they grabbed by force. That's the plain fact. The U.S. had grabbed the Philippines, which we weren't entitled to more than anything else. And Japan had grabbed Korea and Port Arthur. And they're all in the same neighborhood. So if you look on the map over here, this is Japan, and where I'm pointing to the Japanese Empire, which already stretched down to here. This is already America. Now you tell me, America is all the way back here in San Francisco. The U.S. had annexed the Philippine Islands. All of a sudden, that put us in the middle of the Asian cauldron. And, it's only natural Japan should look by and say like this. We'd like that. First of all, it's a threat to us. And second of all, what does America even need to be over here for? And the Americans react similarly. Now, in the time of Theodore Roosevelt, he was a realist. I think I tried to make that point yesterday. And he basically said like this. We could have a war, not have a war. Let's go like this. What's mine is mine, and yours is yours. And I won't touch your stuff, and you won't touch mine. And we'll be happy. If the world had followed this policy, there never would have been a First World War. Because, as I always like to say, First World War was like a Polish firing squad. 7 or 8 countries owned the whole world in 1914. True or not? 7 or 8 countries owned the ganze Welt. Between England and France and Russia and America. And what else is left? Germany had a shtickle, and the Italians had a little, you know what I'm saying, right? A handful of countries. And if you look at a map of the world in 1914, the whole of Africa belonged to one European country or another. And the whole of Asia almost belonged to one European country or another. The only countries that weren't owned by one country is because of quarrels between the colonial powers. If England and France or some other group couldn't agree, so it didn't get taken over. So if 7 or 8 people are successful Ganovim, and they own everything, then the first rule that they should have is, what's mine is yours is yours. If I'm making 10 million a year, you're making 12 million a year, he's making 13 million, what do you care? So this actually was the policy of Theodore Roosevelt. And as a result, the United States made a secret pact. It wasn't secret, but they did announce it, called the Taft-Getz-Seward Agreement. William Howard Taft was Teddy Roosevelt's Kissinger, as we would say today. He was Secretary of War, but he used to send him as a troubleshooter around the world. And Taft when he visited Japan, he really made an agreement in which he said like this: you can take over Korea and we won't do nothing about it, which wasn't fair. And America, if I was to be very religious, is paying the price today. So we stabbed Korea in the back because we had the Korean War and we've had soldiers there ever since. But nevertheless, this would happen. At that time, Roosevelt said, what are we going to have a war? We should fight for the Philippines, they should fight Korea. Leave it alone. In addition to that, there were other issues that could pop up as causes of war, powerful irritants. Very interestingly enough, you have what they call the West Coast racism business. And by that I mean that California was always a cauldron because it's the West Coast. It's a lot of Japanese immigration into the country. And at that time, it drove them crazy. And I can hear why. Because if 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, 4 million come in, next thing you know, it's not going to be California anymore. So the problem at that time was thinking not in terms of Mexican immigration, because that you didn't have so much, believe it or not. But say you had Chinese and Japanese. The United States, back in the time of Grant, I think, or something, or even before that, had passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, if you remember, which is the first time you had sort of like a official racist legislation. But they said, listen, can't bring in 1 million people, it won't be a country. There's a sword to it. Some people say it's very prejudiced, except that they forget or choose to forget The Asian countries are 10 times that prejudiced. They won't let anybody into their country either. You see? So these are the realities. Nevertheless, having said what I said, Japan was a very proud country now. They'd won a war. They were very sensitive to honor. And California, the San Francisco freaked out. So the San Francisco school board said like this: we're taking all the Japanese children and putting them all in one school. You understand? The rest of the schools, public schools are for others. But there's one school for these. So this was seen as a blatantly discriminatory act. The Japanese government went crazy. Teddy Roosevelt said like this: oy vey, California's going to get us involved and the other states have to fight a war. And so he actually brought the school board of San Francisco with the governor to Washington, D.C., and he screamed at them and all the rest of it, and they wouldn't back off. And it's a fairly well-known incident in American history. And by the time it's over, what they ended up doing was making what they called, as you can see over here, they didn't want this. White children and Asian children in one class. You understand? Now it was a whole lot. If it's a little, it's okay. When it's a lot, it's not okay. Is this a white man's land? This is from the California newspapers. So take a look. Let's go to the next one. And they made the U.S. Secretary of State, Eli Root, made a called Gentleman's Agreement, right? And what they said was like this: we'll fix it that the Japanese children can go to any school. We'll get rid of that. But Japan, unofficially, you don't have to say it officially, will stop the immigration. We'll discourage it. You understand? And that's what happened. As I say before, the Japanese were pretty racist to the core. They wouldn't allow anybody who's not Japanese into their country, and except if you're Korean, in which case they treat you like third-class citizens. And the Japanese were not prevented from going to Hawaii. As a result of this, they became the majority population of Hawaii at the time of Pearl Harbor. Okay, I'm sure everybody knows that Roosevelt threw the Japanese into the prison camps in the world. Not in Hawaii, there are too many. It's actually counterintuitive. Hawaii is where you really had Pearl Harbor and you had all the trouble. But this wasn't possible. You get it? There were just too many. And they didn't do anything. But I'm just telling you the reality of living on the West Coast at that time. Ultimately, what I'm trying to bring out is that both countries wanted peace, even though it's not so simple. And a few years later, a similar incident happened in California. We passed another law. At that time, Woodrow Wilson was the president. William Jennings Bryan, famous orator, was the Secretary of State. And it's very famous. The Japanese ambassador said, "Is this the last word? You're not going to change the California laws?" And William Jennings Bryan said, "There's no final between friends." Which means he said like this. I said, what are you coming arguing like that? We're trying to be friends over here. Let's work this out. Which completely disarmed the Japanese ambassador. He wasn't used to that. And he says, oh, okay, if you want to talk like that, that's different. And they ironed it out. They smoothed it out. So a lot of it does have to do, not all of it, a lot has to do with attitude. And that's the point I'm trying to get at. Then came World War I. World War I was an extremely cynical war. I repeat, the cynical war. After all, why did Russia, France, and England fight against Germany and Austria and Bulgaria and Turkey? What? For ideals? You understand? Each one wanted to grab the land from the other. It was full of secret treaties and all kind of things like that. That this one will get this one. Every country came in literally on the basis of Geneva. Italy will get this from Austria. Romania will get this from Hungary. I mean, I could read it to you, but you'd get bored. So Japan made a calculation. They said like this: if it's going to be a war, probably England always wins at the end. That's the history. So we're siding with England. They had nothing against Germany, but we'll get something out of it. And they did. So the Japanese declared war on Germany, even though they're around the world, they had nothing to do with Germany, in World War I. And they took over the German territory in China. And as a reward for participating in World War I, when they came to the Versailles Treaty, a bunch of islands were given to Japan as a payment. No, they got their shekels. There's the Marianas, it's the Carolinas, all the places where the Marines had to fight in World War I. You understand? If I wanted to be cynical and American imperialist, I mean, I'm serious about it. American imperialist, you could always say like this: see, America was dumb. In 1898, they beat the Spanish, beat the pants off them. And we demanded and got the Philippines from the Spanish, which was big, and Guam. We could have taken the whole Marianas and the Carolines also. But McKinley said, what do we need all that stuff for? Big mistake, because then it was left over. And the following year, Spain, instead of just losing another war, sold it to Germany. And therefore, Japan got it from Germany at the end of World War I. And so the American imperialists were saying, if only we would have taken over there. Can you follow all this? It's a chad gadyo. But this is international politics. And this is the reality of how things were done 100 years ago. And as a result, after the First World War, The U.S. was very nervous because Japan had become a big power with all these gains. They owned a ton of islands. And the new island possessions made it easier now for Japan to attack the U.S. Pacific possessions if they wish to. You get it? It's just that's a geography reality. Now, I can assure you, most Americans had no idea what I'm talking about at that time any more than you do. Who's going to sit out and take a map, and who Bichlal even heard of the Caroline Islands, you know? Where's Cape Esperance? You know what I mean? No, nobody knows any of this sort of thing. But you know something? The people who want to know, and the Japanese know, and the U.S. Navy knows. It actually makes a difference. Although both countries were at peace, and had indeed just been allied together against the Germans, the juxtaposition of the two powerful naval powers, because they had two of the strong navies, made the Navy officers in both countries, the American Navy officers, the Japanese Navy officers, start to fear for war and then start planning for it. And it becomes like a self-justifying proposition. Because once I start to figure out, you know, how do we sink the American fleet if it comes to it? Because that's if we ever have a war. Then this is what we'll do. And the other one said, no, don't do it this way, do it that way. And the Americans are doing the exact same thing. You know what happens? An existential tension develops. And from then on, war planning in the 1920s and 30s began in earnest on both sides. And it's also true, to complicate the factor, because it is complicated, Japan wanted to dominate China because China's a big, powerful country. No, it was big. It wasn't powerful at that time. The Chinese began to act together. They're in civil wars. The warlords are all over the place. There was no central government. It was a Hefkerwelt. Really, there were places you couldn't walk on the street, a little bit like the Arab world today. And as a result, the Japanese said like this opportunity, we can take over territory, and we don't even want China to become big and powerful because then they'll go after us. Look how close Japan is to China. And so let's see what we can do in order to exercise our influence over the Chinese. I might add that the Japanese are very racist against the Chinese. A lot of words. You're going to laugh at what I'm about to say, but I don't mean it to be funny. There are a lot of words like chinks in the Japanese language. You understand? And that's one of the reasons in the 1930s they raped Nanking and behaved so brutally to the Chinese. Only Americans with our racism, we say, I guess, you all look alike, so what are one or the other? But it's not true. That's ridiculous. You understand? They're different peoples. And just like Hitler killed the Jews and they were both white, so you can have the Japanese and China kill each other even though they're both yellow, let's say, right? So this was a big issue over there. The Americans, this is a mishigas I'm about to say, but nevertheless, it was a big part of American policy. The Americans in the first part of the 20th century, the last part of the 19th century, looked at China one day to be a Christian country. Get it? A lot of missionaries went over there, and a lot of missionaries had hatzlacha. And I'm talking about from the American point of view now. I'm talking about the reality. I'm talking from the American point of view. Most Americans said like this: the Chinese religions are on their last leg. It's a bunch of Avodah Zarah left from 10,000 years ago. They're still tying the girls' feet together. You know, it's all primitive. The American Protestant and Catholic, especially Protestant missionaries, are coming there, and not only teaching them, the right religion, but they're also teaching them how to cook and how to be modern and wear ties and all the rest of it, and liberating the women and giving education and bringing in medicine and all sorts of things like that. And so we will make China into eventually, on its own, without force, turn it into a Christian country, and that'll be a tremendous chizuk for the Christianity around the world. You can sort of hear that. I might add that is one of the main reasons, why the United States held on as long as it did and supported the Philippines. The Philippines is the only, I think I'm right, the Philippines is the only Asian country which is Christian. You understand? Why is it in Israel, it's all Filipinos and Filipinas? Why don't they bring it up? Because it's a Christian. It's not Muslim. You understand? So religion matters. And therefore there were a lot of Americans, an entire establishment that was invested emotionally in the China issue, and they wanted to help China. And even though, technically speaking, China doesn't care about America, America doesn't care about China, what should it care? So all of this was complicating the tensions that were building up in the 1920s and 30s. I'll say it again, geostrategically, America shouldn't favor China over Japan or one way or the other. But that's not how countries like this operate. As a result, even though it's like a Yetzer Hara, and there should never be a war between America and Japan, everybody started writing books about it. And they were bestsellers. Here's the most famous of them. This was written in 1922 or 23 by a famous British author. And I want to tell you something. It's unbelievable. It's exactly what happened. The Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor on a Sunday morning. the Americans do this, the Japanese take over the Philippines, the Americans go to the Solomon Islands. It's unbelievable. You understand? And you, I don't know if life imitates art or the other way around, because all the American and Japanese naval officers did read this book very thoroughly. You understand? So, and I'm just, and he was a military correspondent for the London Times. So, in other words, talking about doing an Avera helps bring an Avera. At least that's been my experience. So anyway, therefore, there was a lot of tension. So in 1921, the new American administration, Woodrow Wilson was out. The Republicans came in, and the Warren Harding, and the Republicans came in to bring peace and normalcy around the world. And they set up a international, Washington Naval Disarmament Conference. The whole world went there. All the big countries that had navies, the countries that they counted. Believe it or not, the Italians were the big macher once upon a time. And every country had the navy, and the idea was like this. We all spent so much money in World War I that we're broke. And everybody knows that navies and things like that cost a velt. And so the problem goes like this. I get 2 ships, you get a third. I get a fourth to match you, then you get a fifth. So why don't we do, I'll cut down 1, you'll cut down 1. I'll cut down 2, you cut down 2. It's the idea that you and I hear about today when the U.S. and Russia negotiate over reducing the missiles. Okay? In other words, why should we go broke with more missiles? You know, we already have enough to blow up the world 10 times over. Let's cut it down 10%. You understand? It'll save us money, it'll save you money. This was the general idea. The only problem is that some countries, that's President Harding, that's the Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, these were famous names once upon a time. The British and the other ministers. You see all the big machers from Europe and around the world came there, including the Italians and the Japanese were there. That's very important. The big important navies was America, England, and Japan. These were the 3 big navies. Germany once upon a time had a navy, but it lost it. It was wiped out in World War I after the First World War. So the 3 big navies, the ones that count, England had the biggest, America number 2, and Japan. And so what the U.S. did was they said like this, let's agree that we'll all cut down the number of ships and keep the status quo. So in other words, I'll have 5, you'll have 3, because that's what it was anyway. And we'll just always agree to keep like that. So I think America had 5, and England had 5, and Japan had 3, something like that. You know, for every 5 ships you have 3. And it kind of makes sense. The Japanese didn't like it, but the Americans pressed for it because we cheated. We listened on their codes. Yes, they cracked the code. Here, let's go to the next one. That's the treaty. One of the things America did was insist that the Anglo-Japanese alliance be terminated, because England and Japan had a close naval alliance. America said, I won't be afraid, they'll gang up on us. And England had to choose between Japan and America. They didn't like it, but they chose America. Here's a cartoon of a Japanese soldier in the Russian-Japanese war and a British sailor congratulating each other. And here's one, this is in Japanese, if you can kind of get, I know you can't read it, but you get the general idea. Used to be that there was a nice tree together, England and Japan, and now the bad Americans have forced them to chop it down. Let's go to the next one. And here's the guy who was the first code breaker, what they call the Black Chamber. And the result was the Americans knew what the Japanese would put up with. In other words, their starting bid is this, but their bottom line is that. And so Charles Evans Hughes went for the bottom line. And so the bottom line is that the Japanese agreed to inferior position. This was really something that rankled in their throat. And all I'm saying is that things that today we don't even think about mattered a lot to other countries. And that's just a good lesson to know, because we can't help being members of our culture, but things in the world have to do with the way other people see their culture. When, just off the top of my head, when they blew up the 9/11, so I remember, what's his name? It's Osama bin Laden said like this is revenge for 1923. And all the Americans said, what the heck is 1923? When the British deposed the Allies, fired the last Ottoman Sultan, and therefore abolished the Caliphate. You tell the average American, what's Ottoman, what's a Sultan, what's a Caliphate, you know? What's 1923 even, you know? They don't, but they know. To them it matters. So in Japan, they remembered the San Francisco school incident. You know, Americans didn't. And they surely remember the unfair treatment as DC that they got in the Washington, naval conference, even if it wasn't unfair. And as a result, 10 years later, Japan will just, when the coast is clear, Japan will say, we're just not listening to it. We're just unilaterally breaking in, doing whatever we want to build up our own navy. As I say, they didn't like the breaking up of the Anglo-Japanese alliance. And so the result is, as the 1920s and 30s go on, a certain dissonance now develops. The Japanese give serious thought to a future war with America. Now, when I say the Japanese, I mean the Army and the Navy, especially the Navy. I don't say they want it, because they know America is much bigger, it's almost impossible to beat, but they're giving really serious thought to it. On the other hand, the Americans, even in the Navy, they don't really believe the Japs are so stupid to take us on. That's the mentality. You understand? They're not going to do that. They can't hope to win. And so the difference is, Japanese prepared Yomaville and sent spies all over the place. The Americans didn't prepare and didn't send any spies to Japan. You understand? So there was this dissonance. Again, it's a matter of culture. Culture trumps everything. It trumps logic. It trumps tradition. It's remarkable. You understand? Culture is everything. But to Americans, for understandable reasons, relations with Japan at that time are very similar, in my opinion, to our current relations with Red China. Rivalry, yes. Resentment, yes. Territorial disputes, yes. Again, how many people even know that China right now is making claim, to the Pescadores and the Spratly? Nobody even knows what these places are. You understand? I know you do, but most people don't understand. And they're taking them too, by the way. They are taking them. And these kind of things, yes. War, God forbid. Who wants a war with China? Raise your hand. What kind of a nut wants a war with China? And hopefully... War, and we don't know what they do. Thank you. He says, who wants a war with China? And most Chinese, most don't want, but the elites, the general staffs are thinking like that. So you see, you get this kind of a situation. Now, on the other hand, the United States Navy isn't totally stupid, just partially stupid at that time. And so they said, we better get some Japanese speakers, because there's no officers in the American Navy, anything at all. Kihu said about Japan. On the other hand, there's a ton of Japanese going to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia, going to our Naval War College and all that kind of stuff, because you could. How many Americans are going to the Japanese schools and war colleges and all this business? And so, in the good old naval style, we got to start from scratch. So to put out a thing for the Navy, we want 2 guys who want to go learn Japanese and that kind of stuff. Spend 2 years in the embassy in Tokyo, and who's interested? Now, if you know the Navy culture, especially at that time, you don't get promotion unless you're at sea. You understand? When you command the ship, as much as you can, that's your future career. The guys who end up spending time in embassies, all the rest of it, Now, it shouldn't be that way. It's stupid. It's anti-intellectual, but this is culture. You get it? And I don't think it's that way today, but I'm talking about long ago. And so when they put up a sign, they actually get 1 officer who's interested. You'll be shocked to hear a Jew, right? Look, it is what it is. And he volunteers. A guy named Ella Zacharias, you can tell by the name, the only Jewish graduate of Annapolis, I think in the first 15, 20 years of the 20th century. Pensacola, Florida, Reformed Jewish family. You grew up in Pensacola, you grew around ships, agreed? As a little boy, he falls in love with a ship. And as I said before, from a completely un-Jew, I mean, they're German Jew, but you know what I'm saying, no connection with Judaism. And when he's a kid, I'm talking about 1900 and thereabouts, at that time, in the old Navy, all the servants, the busboys, the waiters, and this and that were Japanese. They worked like for nothing. And so all the ships of America, if you go back to the 1890s and all the rest of it, I know it's counterintuitive, but I'm just telling what happened. It's all Japanese. So as a little kid, he wanders on the boats, he sees a Japanese guy, picks up some words, it fascinated him. And then he became a naval officer. And then he said, I'm interested in Japan. And second of all, a Yid thinks a little bit different. He says, the Navy needs a little bit of knowledge of this. Japan could be a war. And so he volunteers very enthusiastically. They're glad they found some jerk who wants to do it. What's really interesting is, contrary to popular belief, it is possible for a Jew, even at that time, to have a successful Navy career, provided he converts to total Navy. Forget Jewish, you have to be 100% Navy. But if you put yourself, you understand, if you're 100% totally devoted to the Navy, you can get promoted, you can have a career. Here's a couple of admirals. People don't know about Admiral Tausig, Admiral Muriel, Admiral Bloch. This guy Bloch was a commander-in-chief of the United States fleet. I might also add that he was the one who was convey of Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet. He's the one who's convey of Pearl Harbor. Notice he turned Pearl Harbor into a fortress and a dry dock and all that kind of stuff. This guy, Admiral Muriel, I know nobody ever heard of him. He was in World War II, but before that, he invented the Seabees. Anybody know what I'm talking about? These are the naval engineers. They won the war. If you know anything about World War, I'll explain tomorrow. They won the war. The engineers, the guys that built the stuff for the airplanes, the runways and all that kind of business. People don't know. So in other words, there were Jewish admirals. You could be. Now this guy goes into Japan. He learns Japanese, as we would say in yeshiva. He's Mayan and the Sugi really totally got into the Japanese stuff. He made friends. He studies the people and the culture closely, like a Yosef in Pharaoh's court, And he immediately learns what a lot of Americans don't know, which is the Japanese think very differently than Americans. Right? They don't just look different than us. It's more important they think different than us. He sees the competitive of the naval officers and how they think of war, because he buddies up with these guys and they go for drinks afterwards. And I'm talking about the Japanese officers, and he sees they're always talking among each other. We'll bomb Pearl Harbor. Well, let's think the American fleet. This, that, and the other, because that's shop talk. You understand? Most importantly, he discerns the false historical memory they have of the Russian-Japanese war and how this leads many officers to imagine they could fight a civil war with America and win it, which they can't. So here you have the problem that we in America suffer from as well, and that's called false memory. If you remember, a few years ago we invaded Iraq. Why did they invade Iraq? I remember we were all part of it. I was also caught up in this, because Bush and Cheney, the other side, yes, listen, we conquered Japan, we conquered Germany, we turned it around. We'll go to Iraq, we'll turn that around also. It's very different, as we discovered. You understand? And they thought that World War II was like a walkover, and then it had a happy ending, and therefore we can do it in the Middle East. It's called false memory. To the Japanese, they're so full of boastful propaganda to themselves that even though, as I tried to mention yesterday, the Russian-Japanese war was a close thing, and Schiff bailed them out with the money, and Teddy Roosevelt bailed them out to get them a peace treaty in time, and Russia was in the middle of a revolution, and things were going their way, and all the cards, and even then they were broke by the time of the end of the war. So it was a close run thing. No, they did win, but barely, and they didn't grab that much. They grabbed enough, but not that much. By the time they finished telling the story over to themselves, they walked all the Russians, they busted them, they took them down by the zillions. The one Jap is worth 10 Russians, 100 Americans. They're crazy. You understand? And it persuaded them that they could take on any country if the conditions are right, and therefore they're really thinking of taking on America. I'm not saying the Japanese people, but the military. And all this was crazy. I mean, Alistair Carey says these guys don't realize what America is in terms of its population, its industrial power, all the rest of it. But it doesn't matter whether it makes sense or not. I know what these guys are thinking. He notices, by the way, that the Japs are spying on us like crazy, and we're not doing anything to them. He gets interested in intelligence work, but he realizes very quickly in the 1920s and 30s, working in intelligence gets you 0 promotions. The Navy officers don't think much of this. He argues for an expansion of the naval intelligence, but he gets nowhere. Ironically, he runs into a guy from the Army on the same thing as him in Tokyo, the same kind of mission to learn Japanese, Jewish guy. Maybe Sidney Mashbear. I mean, I can't make up a name like that, right? Sidney Mashbear, you remember, right? Who will go and have, a very unusual career. None of these guys have the slightest connection with Judaism, but it doesn't matter. They obviously found their niche in the military, and this is the type of life they wanted to have. And Mashbear also runs into opposition from the Army Deadwood, as we would call him over here. He even produces what they call the M Plan, which was still on the books in as late as World War II, the Mashbear Plan, which was to use American businessmen to get intelligence from the Japanese. The kind of thing the CIA does as a matter of course, you understand? Interview each guy that comes back from just pushing things, right? We're not talking about Mata Hari over here. And even that, the Army and Navy was so backwards that he got nowhere with this sort of business. Okay? This Captain Zacharias socialized a lot with all the Japanese officers and diplomats as much as he can. And as a result, he personally becomes friends, and he knows all the Japs who will lead the country in the armed forces in World War II. The guys he plays poker and tennis with are Yamamoto, Admiral Nagumo, commander Pearl Harbor, Yamaguchi, the commander at the Midway. I know these names don't mean them to most people, but these are big, important names over here. And when World War II is going to come around, the Americans are going to say, who are these people? Let me see the files. And this guy's going to say like this, the heck with the files, I'll tell you what you want to know. Because I know him personally, and I'm telling you, if you do this, he'll do that. I know the guy. I know how he played poker. I'm serious. I played 1,000 times with Yamamoto poker. If you do this, he'll do that. But the Navy said, get out of here, you know. So he was proved right, but it was, it didn't help. Now, meanwhile, we will come back to him before we're done. Meanwhile, the Japanese economy goes bad in the late 1920s. For the reason that all the economies have gone bad in the third world, I guess, perhaps, and even, third world, in our lifetime, and is the main reason for the uprisings and upheavals around the world, and that's the too high birth rate. People don't pay attention to that. If you're going to have a policy in which you encourage a lot of babies, you better have the economy that can expand to meet it. The experts will tell you now this has caused the uprising in Syria, even though nobody would look at it. Yeah, I know. Go be iron in the sugi, as they say. Syria, because the Arab country want to fight Israel and be big, so under Assad Sr., they encourage everybody to have 10, 20 children. They give you extra money. And then you have, next thing you know, you have a zillion kids, 15, 18 years old, no job, and not an impossibility of a job. And when you have millions of them, the old secret police tactics of scaring one or two doesn't work anymore. And next thing you know, the country, it blows up. Same thing in Egypt. Same thing in Iraq. Iran is worried about this problem. That's one of the main reasons why they made the deal with Obama and so forth. I know people look at me with a funny face because the Frum Jews goes, what's wrong with having children? If you're talking about a national level, you can either take it from me or not. It's a huge strain on the resources of the country unless the country is very resourceful. You understand? Unless you know how to grow an economy and accommodate them. The Europeans have freely admitted that they don't. That's why they shrunk the population. You get it? That has its own problems. They had to bring in the Arabs to fill in the jobs. But nevertheless, in Japan, there was old-fashioned society and its cultural values. And therefore, everybody had a lot of children. There's no jobs for them. And when the Depression hits, there's really no jobs for them. And so little girls had to be sold into prostitution. It was just a terrible cultural business and very humiliating for a society that considers itself superior. Believe you me, this is the number one problem, not surprisingly, in China. Until recently, the Chinese government has held the line. You can have one kid or two, I forget what it is, But this is the reason. You understand? This is the reason. Because they're quite aware. If they just unleash the business, the economy can't expand like that. And then it's going to bring unbelievable social evils, and they won't be able to control it. You understand? It'll tear the country down. So Japan went through all this. They didn't